It started with a single announcement from the White House, a 25% tariff on Canadian lumber and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy exports to the United States. Former President Donald Trump stood at the podium in February 2025, declaring that it was time to level the playing field for American industry. The political messaging was as bold as ever: America first, no matter who gets hit along the way. But the real surprise came days later. Mark Carney, former Bank of England governor and one of Canada's most respected economic strategists, fired back with a reminder that caught the attention of global markets. Canada, he said, holds over $1 trillion in U.S. investments, money that could be strategically shifted if relations sour. That wasn't just a warning. It was a veiled threat with enough economic weight to shake Washington to its core. Before we unpack how this dispute is sending ripple effects from lumber mills to Wall Street, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our deep dives into the world's most important stories. The February 2025 tariff escalation. The tariffs weren't pulled out of thin air. For decades, U.S. lumber producers have accused Canadian firms of benefiting from unfair subsidies. In Canada, most forest land is publicly owned, and provincial governments set stumpage fees, the rates companies pay to harvest timber, far below what American companies pay on private land. U.S. trade officials have argued that this amounts to an unfair advantage. By imposing a 25% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber and a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas, Trump aimed to reduce reliance on Canadian imports and boost domestic production. But the numbers tell a different story. Canada supplies roughly 30% of the lumber used in U.S. residential construction, and a significant share of U.S. energy imports in northern states comes directly from Canadian pipelines. Cutting that off overnight isn't just difficult, it's economically painful. The $14,000 housing shock. Almost immediately, housing economists began crunching the numbers. The result? A projected $14,000 increase in the average price of a U.S. single-family home by 2027. For many Americans, that's the difference between buying a starter home and staying in the rental market indefinitely. Here's why: U.S. homebuilders rely heavily on Canadian lumber for framing and structural components. Lumber prices have always been volatile, swinging with demand, wildfires, and global shipping costs. But when you add a 25% tariff to that equation, it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. Builders pass the cost to buyers, buyers stretch their budgets further, and the dream of homeownership moves farther out of reach. The National Association of Home Builders warned that if the tariffs remain in place, over 300,000 potential homebuyers could be priced out of the market in the next 2 years. That's not just bad for families, it's bad for the economy. Housing construction fuels thousands of jobs in every state, from carpenters to appliance manufacturers. Weyerhaeuser's profit puzzle. At first glance, domestic lumber giants like Weyerhaeuser might seem like the winners. With Canadian imports more expensive, U.S. producers could sell at higher prices. But it didn't take long for reality to set in. Canada's quick pivot to export more lumber to Europe and Asia meant American firms lost opportunities abroad. By mid-2025, analysts were already warning of a profit collapse scenario. Weyerhaeuser's stock dipped as construction projects slowed, and the cost of doing business rose across the supply chain. Tariffs designed to help U.S. producers risked triggering a slowdown that hurt them just as much as their Canadian rivals. Carney's $1 trillion card. Mark Carney's comments weren't made lightly. Canada's financial footprint in the U.S. is enormous: pension funds, infrastructure projects, real estate holdings, corporate shares, and bonds. If Canada even hinted at pulling investments or slowing reinvestment, the message to global markets would be clear: political risk in the United States is rising. Carney stopped short of saying Canada would act immediately, but the fact that such a move is even being discussed shows how deep this dispute could go. For Washington, the risk isn't just losing lumber, it's losing credibility as a safe and stable economic partner. Canada looks beyond America. Ottawa didn't waste time. Within weeks, Canadian trade envoys were in Brussels, Tokyo, and Seoul, exploring expanded contracts for lumber, minerals, and energy. The EU and Asian markets are particularly attractive, not only because of their demand but also because they don't have the same tariff disputes as the US. This diversification could permanently reduce Canada's reliance on the US market. For America, that means one less dependable ally in global trade, and one more competitor fighting for influence in emerging markets. The builders scramble. Faced with rising lumber costs, U.S. builders started looking for alternatives. Steel framing, insulated concrete forms, and even modular construction methods gained traction. But switching isn't easy. Steel prices have their own global market pressures, and concrete, while durable, doesn't offer the same flexibility or cost efficiency in residential builds. In the end, these alternatives might chip away at demand for lumber, but they can't replace it entirely, especially in regions where wood frame homes are the standard. Washington's logging gamble. The administration's push to expand domestic logging ran into predictable obstacles. Environmental groups opposed opening new forest lands to harvesting. Even when access is granted, nature imposes limits. Softwood trees like spruce and pine take decades to mature. No policy can make them grow faster. Forest fire seasons have also become more destructive in both the US and Canada, wiping out years of potential supply in a matter of weeks. That's a biological reality tariffs can't fix. Canadian mills on US soil. Some Canadian lumber companies saw an opening. By building or buying mills in the US, they could produce American lumber, bypassing tariffs altogether. While this kept some supply flowing, it didn't bring prices down significantly. It also raised questions about whether tariffs were more about political messaging than economic strategy. For many observers, it was a sign of how adaptable Canadian firms could be, turning trade restrictions into opportunities. These mills also allowed companies to maintain relationships with key U.S. buyers, ensuring they stayed competitive in a volatile market while quietly undermining the very tariff walls meant to keep them out. Environmental and biological constraints. Overharvesting isn't an option, not if both nations want to preserve their forest ecosystems. Climate change adds another layer of uncertainty, with pests like the mountain pine beetle destroying millions of acres of timber. Even with ideal conditions, North America's timber supply can't be ramped up at will. The forests themselves face growing threats from prolonged droughts, invasive species, and increasingly intense wildfire seasons. In some regions, recovery times for damaged forests now stretch decades longer than before, reducing the sustainable yield. These natural limits create an unavoidable ceiling on production, making any quick political solution almost impossible to achieve in reality. Midwest political backlash. In states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, the housing squeeze quickly became a political flashpoint. Builders and realtors warned of job losses and stalled developments. Local politicians, even some in Trump's own party, began pressing for a compromise to avoid alienating voters ahead of the 2026 midterms. Town hall meetings turned heated, with residents demanding answers on why home prices were soaring. Construction crews reported delays, and suppliers said they could no longer guarantee costs for upcoming projects. The pressure wasn't just economic, it was personal for many families, whose dreams of building or buying a home now seemed completely out of reach. Canada's quiet leverage. While Ottawa didn't make any sudden moves with its $1 trillion U.S. investment portfolio, the mere possibility was enough to keep Washington guessing. Canadian pension funds alone hold tens of billions in U.S. infrastructure and real estate. A strategic withdrawal could push borrowing costs up, rattling Wall Street and Main Street alike. Financial analysts warned that even minor reallocations could cause market jitters, leading to higher interest rates and tighter credit conditions. For Canada, the threat didn't need to be acted upon immediately. The psychological impact of knowing such a lever exists was powerful enough to influence political calculations in the U.S. Capitol. This fight isn't just about lumber or housing. It's about whether the U.S. can maintain its position as the center of the global trading system. Every time an ally finds a viable alternative to American markets, U.S. influence shrinks a little more. And once that influence is lost, it's nearly impossible to regain. If the tariffs remain, housing affordability will worsen, construction will slow, and U.S.-Canada relations will remain strained. If they're lifted without a clear policy win, Trump risks looking weak on one of his signature issues. For now, both sides are holding their ground, and millions of Americans are left to watch the cost of their homes climb higher, one board at a time. The bottom line, this is more than a trade dispute. It's a stress test for one of the closest economic partnerships in the world. And if both countries fail, the fallout will be measured not in political points, but in the price of the American dream itself.